Welcome to the EXCELcast. I'm Jonathan Kuskiski from the EXCEL program here at the University of Michigan School of Music, Theater, and Dance. And today I'm talking with Bruce Carter, who's a special guest. He's a Dean's Distinguished Fellow at Florida International University and a member of the National Council on the Arts. Thank you so much, Bruce, for coming to talk with us today.
I'm very happy to be here.
Great. And we're going to talk about a subject we have not covered yet in the EXCELcast, which is this idea of integrating design thinking within arts education. You have a project that you're working on right now that integrates design thinking into your own process as a researcher, but has implications in terms of practice for arts education in the world. So can you tell us a little bit about your research right now and the project you're developing and how it's framed?
Happy to. So the idea here is that in design thinking, you're problem solving and trying to go at something at a unique way. And design thinking is really about an iterative process of just breaking down problems. And so what I recognized is that in the string world with violin playing, getting a child to play correctly in the beginning is very difficult. Mm-hmm. So the idea here with this instrument was to design something that could be really cheap and affordable and give kids access to instruments very quickly. So essentially that's what we have here. And this was a project that it kind of looking at it doesn't seem like that much, but it took me about 1.5 years to do. And so it started in a very basic form about like, what are the things that children should be doing in the very beginning as they learn violin playing? And as simple as that sounds, it's actually not so simple after all. So this is the project of me just asking a tons of questions and a lot of processes about designing different models of getting kids moving in kinesthetically complex ways very quickly. So that was essentially the goal early on of the project.
Okay, and so we're looking at how would you describe this? Is this an instrument or is it something else?
No, well, so it's sonically not that interesting of an instrument, and that really isn't the point. The point here is that when you begin early on, there are so many fine motor skills that have to be baked into violin playing. Right. So the idea was to early on to sort of have a grip here and then the space and developing comfort, and then there are different sizes here that these can change so that the child is very comfortable and this floats and it's very easy and very balanced and getting kids comfortable. The other thing great about a 3D printed instrument is that you can see here I've colored this purple, but kids can color it in any way they want, and they can also 3D print their names on it. And with 3D printing, we can make it different sizes very quickly. So we can really draw this out and scale it to the child very quickly in terms for comfort and movement.
I see.
And what's also interesting about it is that one of the biggest problems that teachers would recognize as a violinist is, we call it the gooseneck, where kids are struggling to balance. Yeah. So they end up with this, and then you as a teacher spend years of your life trying to undo this form. But here what I've done is design different size little holders so that the hand shapes in a correct way. And then I've indented first position on the violin. So I'm just setting up ways of helping a teacher identify problems that might exist and then addressing those problems early on in development.
Okay, so without this violin learning assistance device, what would have been the alternative prior to this invention of yours?
The alternative would be this. It's like a toolkit that a good pedagogue keeps in the bag. It's like you would put straws in the F-holes.
I see.
So you would create this bridge that I've 3D printed would be just straws, and then you would draw across it and tell the child to stay within the straws.
To learn, I see. In order to develop a habit of movement that's congruent with sound technique.
Exactly right. And so what the problem with that is that even with straws, there's so much room for wiggle. Right. For wiggle room, exactly. So the idea here was could I create something that would really keep this sharply in line? And then, I see. Of course, this is all left-hand things, but one of the more interesting parts of the design has actually been the right hand. And so here with the right hand, I've got, I don't know if you could see this, but there's indentations for the way that the hand shape moves. I see. So early on in the beginning, you just have the student grab like this, like an egg. And so, but then as they move on, there's actually places for the fingers and a little pinky house for the pinky. Which doesn't seem like a lot, early on, but these are really important habits that you want to bake into movement.
And so this bow, if you will, then fits into the how would you describe the sort of where the the bridge.
Yeah, exactly. So this movement across or near the bridge. So here, it literally just sits
On your shoulder.
like this, and then the child would put it in like this, and then as they play, they would stay right there as a guide.
So you've got this proper sort of, you're creating, right, this habit of proper alignment both for your left hand holding up the instrument, but also this extension that
Exactly right.
with your bow hand.
And then here I've got the different degrees sort of baked in here.
I see.
So this would be the D string, and so this is actually the angle of the D string and the way the bow would strike, so that you're moving correctly as the D string. So it gives the teacher the opportunity to demonstrate different levels and show the way in which the elbow moves. And that's what's really important here is the rising of the elbow.
Okay, so this is amazing. I think that for those watching, when they're thinking about, okay, design thinking, so that must mean the design, you have to be creative in the design of an ergonomic instrument training device. But, and it doesn't quite look like a violin. That's one thing I noticed. So a couple of questions related to that. That seems like it solved multiple problems, and one of the other problems would be cost. So, in other words, how did you come to this modality, 3D printing, if you will, as a modality for this device, and why that method?
3D printing has its ups and downs. Its ups is that you can design very specifically for size. So we could make it really small, like a 1/32 or 1/16 violin for a very small child, or if it was an adult that was a larger adult, I could easily make it a little bit bigger just for comfort and balance to teach that. But with 3D printing, the downside is cost. And so 3D printing is great because it allows, as shown here, I have a lot of different models that show the way in which I got to that. And so 3D printing, you can model in ways that are interesting, and it's not that expensive.
I see. So you didn't go straight from your idea in your mind to that. You had an iterative process. Can you talk to us a little bit about where you started and the difference between an earlier prototype, if you will, and what you ended up with?
I don't want to bore you with the technical part, but one of the real difficulties in the violin was getting the angles right, the angles of the fingerboard to where the position of where the striking point of the bow, and all those angles, and then the distance actually between the shoulder and the arm and what that would look like. Those angles I knew to be extremely important, and so getting that right and getting the feel right was something that was difficult. And so it started with just a very flat instrument and me experimenting with actually size and scale. And then as the instrument grew in complexity, then the questions I was asking about form and comfort started to come into the equation. So I started with the really basic concept. It was the first 3D print. It was just a very flat looking, somewhat violin instrument. And then it got more complex as I went on. But the joy of 3D printing is that you can make those different models. The downside is cost, in the sense that when you start to scale up. So to print a 3D instrument would probably be around $15 or $20 in filament. Whereas I can take this, and the instrument is a lot of different parts, and I can do an injection mold. And the first injection, to make the injection mold is expensive in the first buyout, but then afterwards it's just pennies because it's just plastic. So that's where you would want to go once you have your experiment done. But I'm still, even though I'm a year and a half into this, I feel like I'm a long way away from the final product yet.
I see.
I still continue to ask questions and make the instrument better and better, I think.
So in other words, when we're talking about design thinking here, it's more than just the design itself. It's the process that you go through to improve upon the idea, to make it more efficient or effective, or deliver value, the outputs you're hoping to get out of that project in a more efficient way, right? Because you're able to assess quickly what works and what needs to be adjusted. In this case, use 3D printing to make a new version of that, test it again, and accelerate through that iterative process towards the ultimate product, if you will. Is that correct?
Absolutely, and that really is the value of 3D printing. And there's a great alignment with design thinking, because in design thinking, you're encouraged to, you're not failing, you're just going through a process of making things better. And the encouragement of always interrogating the design and questioning what are the ways in which it can be better for a number of different reasons. So the 3D printing really is a great match for design theory.
Okay, so how does that apply? I mean, you're an arts researcher, you're a musician, you actually have a composition background as well, Master's in Composition from Peabody,
That's right.
Johns Hopkins, and a PhD in music education research from Northwestern, correct?
Correct.
So how does in what ways can we take these core concepts of design thinking that are exemplified in your project, how do they apply to musicians or performing artists at large? In what way can we maybe think about integrating some of those concepts in an active way in our work that might help us in our pursuits?
I think the first thing is to understand whether you're a jazz improviser or a composer, there's so much that you do learn in the creative process as a composer or as an improviser that then very much lends itself in design thinking and design theories, and to understand and value what it is in your training as a musician and composer, and embrace that and take that as that learning that happens early on, and then ask, through that lens, how can that make me a better thinker, researcher, in whatever modality you choose to go through. And that's something I think it was encouraged when I started at Northwestern, to learn to be a researcher through the lens of a composer, to take all those things that I've learned about form and scale and value that you learn, through these, whether you're an architect or composer, but the way in which you learn scale and form, and then you produce a product and understand the ways in which products are important and the ways in which they're read, that very much helps you move into different modalities, whether it might be. I certainly never thought I would be designing instruments, but it's not so far afield really when you stop and think about it.
So that's interesting. So would you say, and I know this varies from from person to person in terms of their process as a composer or a performing artist, but it seems to me that iterative practice is baked into that work. It's just that we don't often think about how connected that might be to other modalities of work. It may not be so much part of our culture, I think, to accept that iteration and failing forward, if you will, is an inherent part of being creative.
And I don't think we talk about that enough. If you think about when you're a piano student and you begin, and you remember like the Bastion learning series, right? And you just wanted to go ahead to the next song because you knew the song was harder. And what a value to give to a child to understand that, as you move through, things are going to get harder, and that's okay. And I'm going to embrace the next page. I'm going to embrace the difficulty. And I may not have it yet, but knowing early on as a child that if you work towards it, you're going to get there. And you're going to look back at the past pages and think, wow, I remember when that was hard. And you extrapolate that metaphor into the ways in which musicians can approach life like that. And that I know I'm approaching something, it's going to be difficult, but I understand what failure looks like. I understand what it's like to have to work at something. I know how to scaffold my own thinking. I know, so I know how I self-learn, and I know it from the piano. So if I approach this math equation that I'm trying to solve, I know those feelings, and I know how I'm going to deal with it. That's a really wonderful part of music and music education.
Yeah.
And I think as music educators, as musicians, we should be out there trumpeting that as loud as we can for all to hear.
I agree. Well, and certainly what you're speaking about is this process that's inherent, both in terms of the work that you're describing with design thinking here in this project, but also in our work, generally speaking, as being one that develops resilience, discipline, ultimately maybe empowerment would be a nice outcome.
Absolutely.
And of course your work has a strong social justice thread running through it. So can you talk now, just bringing it back to the project we started with, a little bit about what the outcomes you hope from this project, what they might be? Obviously it seems like these are meant to be played by students. So tell us a little bit more about the goals.
Well, the idea here is that it's really access. And so this is going to be, sonically it will make a sound as the bow moves, a humming sound. But the idea is that any child that wants an instrument to learn, to sort of have an idea what it's like to play a violin, can get one. So what I want is to create a nonprofit, and the nonprofit will make sure that this instrument gets in the hands of any teacher and child that wants an instrument. So that's the ultimate goal, to reach out to Kickstarter and other organizations to make that happen. And so for me, early on in my life, growing up, I didn't have necessarily access to the best instruments or music education, and that definitely drives me as I want every child, even if they want an instrument and they know it's not the best, why not give them something that forwards their musical education, that gives them an advance? Just because they don't have the best wooden violin doesn't mean that they shouldn't have something that could perhaps harm their development as they go towards learning a violin. So my thought here is to really get this in as many hands as kids that want them, and to provide it as an opportunity, not just as a pedagogically advanced instrument, but rather something to get kids active and involved in music making. So that's really the goal.
Well, that's exciting, and it's so great to see this kind of the potential impact for this project. Of course, you talk about access, and I think about young beginners and people that might not have access to or equitable access to music education. But frankly, it seems like the inherent values within the product itself could be of value to basically anyone who's learning the instrument for the first time, because it's baking in better habits early on. So
it's interesting you would say that, because I've showed this to a few people, and so many adults have said, "Can I have one?" and they're not musicians per se, but I've always wanted to learn the violin, and could this help me learn more quickly? And I've always, it just makes me smile, because in the beginning it really was a thought about this is a first step for a child learning a violin.
Yeah.
But I think there might be a there in really helping anyone, and I need to broaden my aperture to include anyone that wants to learn the violin, that this might help them.
That's great. Okay, so one last thing before we go today. So we've talked about research, and of course the practitioner impact of this research. And you of course you teach as well, have taught, but you also work at the policy level, serving on the National Council on the Arts. And so I'm curious about your experience in that role. What's it like, and in what ways do you see the mindsets that we've been discussing, any potential practical applications of, say, design thinking or the other work that you've done as it applies to that? Because it seems to me that you're in a somewhat unique situation where you're simultaneously operating at a practitioner level, impacting a community, but you have a voice and a role at sort of the 60,000-foot view of arts policy in the States. So I'm wondering what connections you see between those two roles, and what it's like for you to serve on the council.
Quickly, I'll say what it's like. It is absolutely fantastic to be a part of. The other council members are just thrilling to be around, and at meetings we start every meeting by everyone going around just sharing what they see, what do they see in the world, and what are they doing. And I feel like in that hour of going around and sharing, I learned so much about architecture and art in these different disciplines that I really don't think that deeply about. And to hear what's going on in the most current ways in terms of funding, education, and the way people are viewing film and industry, it allows me to see the arts in a lens that, as an academician, I would have never had the chance to see before. So it is an incredible learning experience for me, because I'm able to see and appreciate the arts in such a wider view. And there's a part of me that laments, I think the Academy is wonderful and I'm so happy to be a part of it, but I realized very quickly early on, I'm in my 4th year, that just how siloed I was in the way that I positioned myself as an arts researcher. And the biggest gift has been really thinking about the way in which the arts exist in so many ways across the country, from very small nonprofits, to the university level, to mom and pop shops that do what they can to make the arts possible. So the aperture in which I view the arts experience has changed dramatically, and that has informed, I think, part of the Violin Project, because with so many council members, there's this drive for access, and access that is equitable. And just really beautiful people that serve on the council that speak in such eloquent ways, and I can't help think that planted a seed in my head about what can I do, and what can I talk about at the table when it's my turn. When we go around to talk about what am I doing personally to make a difference and to provide access. And so I'm happy that their next meeting is in 2 weeks. And I do plan on bringing the violin, and at show and tell, I will have something to show and tell.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Well, and a great sort of call to action for our students too. I often close our talks by asking, just generally speaking, let's say, we're talking to our audience of students primarily who are drawn to this subject because they want to make some impact in the world. That's my belief. That's what I've observed here at Michigan, is that most students, they actually have multiple goals. They might have aesthetic goals, but they do want to see the world better through their art making. And so what kind of tips, advice would you give, parting tips, if you will, to them to start to take some reasonable first steps towards exploring that kind of practice?
My biggest piece of advice would be, they're good at people early on, and it's just human nature that say that what you're doing isn't necessarily a good idea. And so beware the naysayers early on. And that's not to say that you shouldn't listen to them and take that and think, okay, what am I doing that allows them that's causing this knee-jerk reaction? And what are they really trying to tell me? So it's important to learn from that, but you need to stay strong to your own ideas. And that even with the violin project, there are certain pedagogues that are like, well, I can see where this would be a problem. And at first I was, downtrodden that how could you not think my idea is great? But then really having the maturity to say, okay, tell me what you're thinking. How can I make this better? And even if you'll never agree with me, what are the ways in which optically I can present my idea so that it's more well received? So you're always positioning sort of the optics of what you're doing, and then how everything can be not just better, but perceived as better as you give your pitch to what you're doing.
That's great. And another example of using the iterative process and a practice of iteration to advance your ideas while still being receptive to its environment and to learn from the feedback that you're getting. It's great advice for all of us. Well, thank you so much, Bruce, for coming by, talking to us about design thinking, and to share this exciting product that you're working on. And we look forward to learning about that work and its impact in the future.
Thank you for having me.